I'm Justin Jacobs, and I'm sitting here today with Lisa Leff, the author of The Archive Thief, which talks about a Jewish historian who, from the 1930s to the 1960s, first collected and then eventually stole tens of thousands of documents related to Jewish history in Europe. I noticed while reading this book that many of the themes that you explore are similar to the themes that I've looked at in my own research. I examined foreign expeditions in China and their interactions with local elites. And what I was struck by most in reading your book is how the discourses that are deployed, the discourses that are used to justify the removal of archives in Europe during the post-war era were strikingly similar to many of the discourses that I've encountered when I'm looking at men like Orlstein in China. How do you justify the removal of artifacts, or in this case manuscripts and archives? Usually you invoke the discourse of preservation or the discourse of science, a higher aim, and you say, you guys aren't capable of preserving this, you guys aren't capable of analyzing it in a scientific manner, therefore we have to remove it. We have no choice but to remove this in the name of a higher cause. I'm wondering, in your research on Tchaikovsky, if you see a similar discourse in play justifying what he's doing. Because, for instance, you note how French officials were complicit in allowing 76,000 Jews to be deported to Nazi camps in the 1930s and the 1940s, and we know that Jewish institutions and property were not protected by the French state. Yeah. Is this a similar discourse that is used to sort of mitigate and even justify or redeem Tchaikovsky in his removal of all these documents?
Yeah. I mean, in the moment where Tchaikovsky really first starts taking stuff, it's during Liberation. It's right at the end of World War II when he's in France and Germany. And absolutely at that time, there's this language of preservation and even, like the word you use, redemption. That's being bandied about in his letters and in the letters of the people who are receiving it, and also other Jews who are in Europe who are also finding Jewish things and sending them to the United States right after the war. And this language in their case, I mean, it is a scientific language of preservation. It is about, who's going to best take care of this. So it is a scientific language. But it's also, the language of redemption really takes on a different meaning in this moment, in the wake of the Holocaust when 6 million Jews died. And you can see in the way that all of these people who are salvaging Jewish papers and Jewish books and other Jewish artifacts use this language of redemption almost as if they're going to redeem the people who have been killed.
It's political as well, right?
Political.
It's a political discourse ultimately.
It is ultimately because, for Jews, this is kind of a nationalist agenda, get mm-hmm. Jews out of Europe. But they're operating in a framework where they don't have a state yet, and the state that they need to convince to help them is the United States military authorities on the ground in Europe. And for them, the concern is, there's a humanitarian concern, right? Help the Jewish people. They have a degree of empathy for them. But there's also the Cold War brewing, and getting Jewish things out of Europe is absolutely on their mind for political reasons, as they see half of Europe, the Europe where they would have to send back all these looted Jewish documents. They see, the Soviet Union starting to take over. So there is a political concern there. And it actually struck me that there's a connection to your work here because, reading your work on foreign archaeologists working kind of at the edges of China in the 1920s and 30s, they too are operating in a universe where they have to deal with local officials and also nationalist officials back in the capital in order to remove foreign things. So I wonder if there too, we're seeing basically issues about cultural sovereignty and cultural property interacting with politics. I even wondered, reading your work, is all of this talk about culture and science and getting artifacts out really just a cover for politics? Mm-hmm. At least from the point of view of the officials on the ground.
Well, it's a political act, I think, for both sides. The foreign explorers, certainly for them, it's a political act to be able to say we're going everywhere throughout the world, removing these items and putting them in our museums, not anyone else's museums. The British say we're taking it to London, not to Paris, and that's, they want everyone to know that.
Right.
From the other side as well, that's where I think it gets really interesting, and that's what I've looked at more in my own research is how did the foreign explorers interact with the local Chinese elites, local Chinese officials, and ultimately the national government as well. And you find out that for them as well, it's also a political act, but in a different way. What they realize is that if we allow someone like Oral Stein to come into our jurisdictions and remove a bodhisattva head, this will curry us good favor with the British Raj in India. And we actually see this several times. At one point, I have this wonderful example where the Chinese national government is trying to kick out Oral Stein, and the Indian government, the British Indian government, threatens to cancel a shipment of weapons to the local governor if you don't let Stein continue his expedition. The local governor wants those weapons. It's political for him. And so I found that political actors are pretty much always willing to negotiate, especially if they're in a poor country, a resource poor country, and they find that they can get diplomatic goodwill and other intangible benefits by allowing a foreign expedition to occur or for artifacts to leave the country.
Right.
But the thing that I also noticed is that the politicians are not the only actors. All right, within any domestic context, the politicians have to answer to usually nationalist intellectuals and a nationalist press as well. And they can use their clout, they can use their ability to drum up popular indignation to tarnish the credibility of any given politician. And so it's a little bit of both, when you look at these questions of cultural sovereignty from sort of a bird's eye perspective, from an international perspective, it appears as though it's just imperialists versus nationalists, and both sides are united. And
Right.
you realize when you dig a little deeper, they're not. The French are competing with the British, and the Chinese from one province are competing with national leaders in the metropole.
Right. And then there's scientists, right, who have their own political agendas.
Right.
Yeah.
So it gets much more complex and messy in a hurry once you start getting beyond just sort of the discourse of cultural sovereignty and realize what's really at stake on the ground between the people who are involved in these negotiations.
Yeah.
One of the other fascinating things that struck me when I was reading your book is the parallels between museums as an institution, as a classification system, and archives. Because you're dealing with archives, I often deal with museums.
Right.
Stein is taking stuff and removing them to museums. Tchaikovsky is taking things from archives and moving them to new archives. And you have this description of Tchaikovsky in the archives in Strasbourg. And as he's going through the archival materials, you notice that documents on French Jewish history, on Jews in France, is organized according to how the state views its internal institutions.
That's right. That's how it's kept in the archive, right? Because an archive is simply the collection of the state leader, right? All of the things that they did, all of their papers. So when they dealt with Jews, their papers are there, but when they dealt with other subjects, they're right alongside them. Right? That's what an archive is.
Right, and that can actually encourage or lead a historian, perhaps unconsciously, if they follow the archival arrangement, to write a history in which Jews are basically assimilated to French society. It's a history of Jews in France, in this particular area, as the state.
Right.
They're part of the fabric of French society.
Exactly.
Right?
They're just one minority group alongside others governed by the state.
Right.
And that's how they were in the archive in France.
And yet you have this wonderful passage in which you describe how Tchaikovsky, after he steals, and it is theft in this case, after he steals some of the documents that he finds documents on the Jews in various files, takes them out, and when the police are alerted to his theft, they go to his hotel room just a few blocks away, and they find that he has already rearranged these documents to sort of whitewash the presence of the French state. And it's the documents now would encourage someone to write a history of Jews for the sake of Jewish history outside of the context of France. And you could even then take this and compare it with the history of Jews anywhere else in the world.
That's right. And then when he winds up selling documents like those to American Jewish research libraries and Israeli Jewish research libraries, they arrange them, right? They become French Jewish documents in a series that sits alongside German Jewish documents or Italian Jewish documents. So what they wind up creating, even in the absence of a state, what they wind up being able to create is a kind of national archive.
Mm-hmm. It just seems like it's a reminder that museums, many people accept now that or many scholars accept that museums have a political agenda, even if perhaps the caretakers and the museum goers may not even be aware of it. It is presenting a particular view of the world.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting about your research is you show that archives often can do this to the people who think that they're trained to detect a trap like this, and yet historians can walk right into it by accepting the way that an archive has organized its documents. And it got me thinking about the difference in my own studies about what kind of museums are out there. You have what some people refer to as encyclopedic museums, in which there is a pretension to sort of display and represent pretty much all known phenomenon in the universe. All
Yeah.
natural sciences, all humanities, the British Museum, the Louvre, these sorts of places. They may not succeed, but they purport to do that.
Right.
They want to do that. And this is juxtaposed with many often museums that were created at a later date, known more as maybe a national museum, in which their aims are much more modest. They know they can't get all the materials they need to be an encyclopedic museum, and their goal is quite simply to stimulate pride within the more restricted parameters of their collection. For instance, this is a museum of Turkish history.
Right.
In Turkey, and that's all we're showing. We're not purporting to show the development of the natural sciences throughout the world. This is just Turkish history, and you're supposed to be proud of being a Turk when you come out of this museum.
Right.
Do you see this parallel with
well, in a
archives?
way, the construction of these Jewish library collections, was an encyclopedic effort, even though they wind up creating a national collection, right? A collection that reflects the history of the Jews everywhere they lived. The effort that went into it was kind of like, maybe we could call it a reverse encyclopedia, where they went all over the world and gathered up documents in order to create this new national archive, right? One of the things it really shows is that this can operate without a state.
Mm-hmm.
We think of most of the great, big archives as the work of states. That's what they were. These Jewish archives are of a different sort. They're national archives that were formed without a state.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
I really enjoyed reading the book, and I hope many more people will go out and read it as well. Thanks for sharing your research with me, and good luck.
Yeah, good luck to you with your research.
Thanks.